Bible gives instruction on how hard you can beat your slave. Oh yeah? Yep.
All right, let's see it.
Exodus 21:20. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property.
So first off, this is a mistranslation. The text does not say if the slave recovers after a day or two. The text says if the slave survives for a day or two. The idea being if they survive for a day or two and then die, then there's no punishment.
Right, this is a verse that's quoted often from typically atheists who think anyone should care about their subjective morality, but a lot of Christians struggle with this passage as well. Yeah, it's pretty brutal. So first of all, these slaves were indentured servants, meaning they served masters to pay off debts. This wasn't pre-Civil War African-American slavery where people were kidnapped and abused. This was the beginning of God bringing the Hebrews out of a barbaric state into a new way he was carving forward for them and ultimately the world.
So this is an apologetic attempt to rehabilitate biblical slavery and make it sound like it really wasn't all that bad, and it is rife with misinformation. The two nouns here are ebed and amat, and neither points unambiguously to indentured servitude. They could refer to indentured servants just as well as they could refer to chattel slaves, and chattel slavery was absolutely endorsed and condoned within the Hebrew Bible. Now, it wasn't race-based chattel slavery, but that's because the concept of race as a question of skin color was only invented within the last 1,000 years when European Christians sought to authorize and legitimize their imperialism and their colonialism. But that does not make the chattel slavery of the Hebrew Bible any less abusive. Sex slavery was quite common. We have stories of men impregnating their female slaves without any regard or concern whatsoever for the agency of those slaves. And the reference to saying, well, it's not about kidnapping, is a part of this apologetic attempt to deny that chattel slavery is a part of the Bible, because there's another passage in Exodus 21 that assesses the death penalty if freeborn Israelite men are kidnapped. And so the argument is that chattel slavery requires kidnapping, therefore prohibiting kidnapping prohibits chattel slavery. And to begin, chattel slavery does not require kidnapping, but that would also directly conflict with the explicit endorsement in Leviticus 25 of chattel slavery. And if you go look in the legislation of other societies from ancient Southwest Asia, they also explicitly endorse chattel slavery while also explicitly outlawing kidnapping freeborn males.
Okay, so if you go to verse 26 and 27 of that same chapter, it says that if a master hits a servant and damages an eye or chips a tooth, the master had to let the servant go free. Their contract was broken. Weird, isn't it? It's almost as if God was saying, don't abuse your servants because they're humans too.
So the text is doing absolutely no such thing whatsoever. The text is actually explicitly identifying a slave as less than a full person. This section is just going over the principle of talionic justice, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And then it goes, oh yeah, not for slaves. It's not eye for eye. If a master gouges out the eye of a slave, the slave just goes free, because a master obviously will prefer that to having their own eye gouged out. The punishment is less severe because the slave is not a full person. And that fits with the previous statement that if you accidentally kill a slave, you don't get punished. If you accidentally kill a full person, you get the death penalty. So the punishments are different for slaves than they are for full persons. And another thing one needs to keep in mind is that these laws are not systematic and they're not consistent, and they were almost certainly not widely known, and they were definitely not widely enforced in the period in which they were written. We don't see enforcement or widespread knowledge of these laws until around the 2nd century BCE, at which point the different, very inconsistent law codes are being harmonized through an oral tradition. So in this time period, these were prestige laws. These were things to put on display to show how just and ordered our society was. And this is part of the Covenant Code, which is actually taking these laws from laws of Hammurabi. And if you want a great book discussing precisely how the Covenant Code makes use of the laws of Hammurabi, David Wright's book, Inventing God's Law, is a great discussion.
In fact, God repeatedly says to the Hebrews in various verses, you know what it was like to be a slave, so treat others like this. Fill in the blank.
So this is a reference to a different set of law codes, specifically in Deuteronomy, where this reciprocal, you were slaves, so treat the slaves the same way, is an explicit reference to how to treat debt slaves who sell themselves into slavery and are going to go free in the 7th year. The requirement is that they be provided with goods when they exit the master's house. The law codes in Exodus say absolutely no such thing whatsoever and actually directly contradict the law codes regarding debt servitude in Deuteronomy. For instance, in Exodus, female debt slaves never go free. In Deuteronomy, female debt slaves go free in the 7th year, just like male debt slaves, because these are two different sets of laws written in different time periods by different people, and neither of them were widely enforced and probably not even widely known until the 2nd century BCE.
But if we go back to the verse you quoted, when it says, if they survive after a day or two, the master won't be punished, the word punished in Hebrew is the word nakam, which is specifically used regarding the death penalty.
This is flatly false. This verbal root is not used in any piece of legislation anywhere in the Hebrew Bible to refer to the death penalty. The death penalty is always referred to as life for life, or some variation of a verbal root that means to die or to kill. Every single time punishment for crimes against a slave is brought up, that punishment is less severe than punishment for the exact same crime against a full person, an Israelite, a citizen. We've already seen that with the Talionic justice regarding an eye and a tooth. It holds for accidentally killing a slave, which gets no punishment. If you accidentally kill a full person, an Israelite, a citizen, it's life for life, the death penalty. Intentionally killing a slave is not going to result in the exact same punishment as intentionally killing a full person, an Israelite, a citizen.
So no, this isn't giving instruction on how much they could abuse their servants. In fact, read it again. If they didn't recover after a day or two, what would it mean if they didn't recover after a day or two? What if it took 3 days, 4 days, or even a week?
Well, according to the passage, the master would have been punished in that case.
Exactly, and that punishment would have been death for the master.
Flatly false based on this mistranslation. The text is not talking about how long it takes the slave to recover. The text is talking about how long the slave survives before ultimately dying.